accelerate lending to the private sector and for closer working ties. Now, the New Development Bank, formerly referred to as the BRICS Development Bank, was addressing the BRICS Business Council meeting in Durban. One of the achievements of the BRICS Group is the establishment of this BRICS Bank. The bank's headquartered in China, while the regional bank is in South Africa. And to tell us more about this milestone, we are joined in studio by the Vice President of the New Development Bank, Leslie Maasdorp. Mr. Maasdorp, thank you very much indeed for your time. I was fortunate enough to be in Shanghai in 2014 when the announcement was made that it would be headquartered in Shanghai. And I remember speaking to the Consul General of South Africa there, and there was great optimism. But what has the bank achieved since then?
Ben, it's been an exciting 3 years now. It's amazing how time flies. I arrived there first week of July 2015. At that stage, the bank was an idea. It was a concept. It was a dream by the leaders of BRICS. 5 employees arrived, the President Kamath from India, and 1 vice president from each of the other 4 BRICS countries. Today, we have 130 staff, professional staff, so the bank has significantly grown in size. Secondly, in terms of our core mandate of providing funding for infrastructure, building roads, building ports, providing new power infrastructure and so on, the bank has approved $5.7 billion of loans in the BRICS countries. That translates to about 80 billion rand if you do a conversion to South African rand. So that's a significant amount of new investment in infrastructure. But let me make it real. Let me give you an example. For example, in South Africa, we have approved a loan to Transnet, which is dedicated to the port of Durban. So essentially, we will be deepening and widening that port, allowing for more goods more containers to be able to come in. What that means is that firms can produce more. There'll be more throughput through the port of Durban. As you know, most of South Africa's imports and exports go via Durban. So that's kind of the real impact that these projects have. You know, often when people speak about these projects, it sounds quite high level, but this translates into real, concrete economic growth in the country.
Has Eskom also benefited from the BRICS Bank?
So our first loan that we approved was indeed to Eskom. It was a focus on providing support for the transmission network for renewable energy. In other words, there's a number of independent power producers on the renewable side, for example, solar PV plants that have been set up. But you need to connect those to the national grid so that Eskom in turn can distribute. There's been some delays in the finalization of that particular loan, but it is ongoing.
So far, have all 5 countries applied for loans from the bank?
Absolutely. We have approved so far 23 projects in the 5 BRICS countries. It's not necessarily been equal because the countries are varying in size, varying in economic size, varying in sort of the sector focuses and so on. But because the bank is equally owned by the 5 BRICS countries, over time there will be some broad equilibrium in the way that the portfolio is spread. But if you give you an example, I mean, China is an $11 trillion economy. It is more than 30 times the size of South Africa, to give you sort of a number. India is also a very large economy. So you would naturally see that maybe the portfolio would be skewed towards those 2 countries. But that is just a function of their sheer size. Over time, South Africa will be as much as a beneficiary from the bank as much as China.
What about countries outside the BRICS groupings, if they wanted to tap into the funding?
So the bank right now is owned by the 5 BRICS shareholders in equal forms, 20% each, but by the 5 countries. But when it was set up, in the Articles of Agreement, the legal founding documents, it was always envisaged that the bank will over time expand and will become a global bank. And BRICS, as you know, as a formation in any event, is more aspirationally the voice of emerging markets. So over time, I'm sure BRICS itself, they're already referring to BRICS Plus, for example, will incorporate other nations. Last year at the summit in Xiamen in the Fujian province in China, President Xi invited about 7-8 other heads of state. This time around, President Ramaphosa has also invited, I think, 10 other heads of state. And this is all part of broadening that collaboration. But to come back to the New Development Bank, over time the bank will indeed expand to give effect to what is our mandate in the articles. At this stage, we are focused on the 5 BRICS countries, but we also want to support regional economic integration and regional connectivity. For example, if you have a project that can provide power to a number of countries, or if you can build a rail line where South Africa is part of it but it involves other countries, you can have much bigger economic impact. So we are very keen to have those kinds of projects so we can benefit the region. And later on, as the bank expands, we'll be able to lend to countries outside of the 5 BRICS members.
Let's explore the model of this bank. How is it funded?
Yeah. So the bank has a capital base of $50 billion. So that is divided into 2 parts. The first part is what we call equity or paid-in capital. That is real cash coming from the 5 countries, right? That number is $2 billion for each member country. And it comes in installments. So every year, each country places about $300 million. That's about 3.4 billion rand or so that comes into the bank as the equity. By 2021, that full $10 billion would be paid in. Then there's another category of funding. It's called callable capital. And that really is a form of a guarantee. In other words, the bank has access to that funding should we need it. But the important point here, Blaine, is that most of the funding of a development bank, a bank of this nature, comes from the debt capital markets, meaning we issue bonds, we raise resources in the capital markets, and then we on-lend those funds. In other words, we issue, for example, let's say we issue a bond here in South Africa, right? So we raise money from asset managers, pension funds, institutional investors, and so on. We have to pay those investors a certain rate of interest, right? We then on-lend those resources at a higher rate of interest, and we still make a modest return. So in other words, our capital is not touched, but we have really lent resources from money we've borrowed from other people. That in a nutshell is how a multilateral development bank actually operates.
Sure, but is it anyway near a true alternative to, say, for instance, the IMF and the World Bank?
Yeah. So the bank was never created to be an alternative to the World Bank. It sets very clearly in our articles we are meant to complement the existing financial system. However, what we are trying to do is to bring some new innovation, look at alternate ways to provide infrastructure financing in a more efficient way. But it was never set up really to replace the existing established financial institutions.
What about the call for an accelerated lending to the private sector? Is that part of the plan?
Yeah, that is most definitely part of a plan. In fact, we have just approved our first 2 loans in that space. You would know that most of the infrastructure, for example, in telecoms, whether it's mobile telephony, whether it's high-speed internet access, whether it's renewable energy, solar, offshore wind, and so on, the private sector is very active in providing that kind of infrastructure. So the reason why we are extending lending to the private sector is because we want to ensure that we can also crowd in more money into infrastructure finance. So for example, let's say in South Africa, if we build a new renewable energy power plant, it would not just be funded exclusively by the bank. We would want to bring in your large development finance institutions here, other private providers of capital, so you have a bigger pool of capital for the funding. So the next phase of our growth is going to be in that arena to private sector clients.
And just tell us about the role that the institution that is based here in South Africa plays.
So the Africa Regional Centre is a very important creation of the bank because it is our first regional office. One of the key challenges that one faces in infrastructure finance, Blade, is that often there's a huge demand for new roads, new ports, new bridges, and so on. But the projects have not been packaged. The projects are not bankable. They're not ready or shovel ready, as is sometimes been referred to, meaning that a bank can assess the project and provide the funding. One of the core functions of the Africa Regional Centre is to ensure that we strengthen our project pipeline. But that's only one of the functions. As the bank expands, it will play a very important role as the voice of the bank here in Africa. Because over time, as we said earlier on, the bank will have new members outside of South Africa.
So in terms of the summit, the 10th BRICS Summit happening starting tomorrow, what's on the agenda in terms of what new discussions are on the table in terms of the BRICS Development Bank?
So I just returned last night from the BRICS Business Council in Durban, where a series of discussions took place with the private sector, if you like. All the BRICS countries have senior business leaders who were here, and we had a dialogue with them, talking about how we can now look at the next milestones of the bank. What is next? Similarly, at the BRICS Summit, there's a very broad agenda. Remember, the New Development Bank is only one creation. It's a formal institution created by the BRICS countries, but there's collaboration and on a number of fronts, investment, trade, and so on. So the New Development Bank is only one agenda sort of item. One of the aspects that will be looked at now is to define more clearly a more medium-term vision, because 10 years have now gone by. 10 years is a long time. Questions will be asked: what will be what's the ambition and the objectives for the next 10 years, because a decade has now gone by. I know that from the New Development Bank side, one of the key aspects will be expanding the lending, and then also looking at the next phase of the bank's growth when it acquires new members.
Mr. Maasdorp, thank you very much indeed for your time. Great insight into the New Development Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank. That was Leslie Maasdorp, the New Development Bank Vice President. Well, police have launched